You will have seen, or a lot of you will have seen overnight, the horrendous pictures coming out of Rafah last night. Let's talk about this with Professor Michael Clarke, Professor of Defence and Security and former Director General of RUSI. Good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Sheila.
We just heard earlier on when Keir Starmer was asked about this, what he thought Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel should do next. And he said simply, stop. I mean, this is a message that's being repeated, not least from international courts. And yet the same day, Israel says, rightly says, Hamas have been firing on us, not with the same consequences because of the what's it called? Forgive me, the shield that they have,
Iron Dome.
Iron Dome, thank you, to protect them. But it's a mess, isn't it? The whole thing is a mess as to when there can be some movement, and the hostages are still there, and children are still being killed, and the whole thing seems like a mess.
Yeah, this crisis is going around in circles with no progression at all, and the only people who suffer all the time are the Palestinians. So, the facts we know is that 8 rockets were fired from the area of Rafah yesterday. Didn't do any damage. They were fine. They were intercepted. But this is the first rocket firing since January that Hamas have conducted. So we know they did that. It seems to be very unlikely to me that those rockets were fired from the Tal al-Sultan area, which is this tent city which has grown up in a so-called safe area of Rafah. But maybe they were, but I think that's personally unlikely. And of course,
why is it unlikely? Do we know what?
Because I don't think it would provide very good firing points. Generally speaking, when Hamas fire missiles, they usually do them from either very close to buildings or in playgrounds, in yards, where you've got to be able to get the launchers out quickly, fire something off, and then get rid of the launchers again. In the middle of a tent city, which is under constant surveillance by the Israelis, it would be quite difficult to do that. So maybe they did, because they do use civilians as cover for these things, but the response by Israel again doesn't seem logical if they were just responding to this. And I think the rocket attack is just an excuse. The fact is the Israelis wanted to go after Yassin Rabia and Khalid Nagar, these two Hamas. One's a chief of staff, one's an assistant, and both of these are Hamas people who operate on the West Bank. And I think probably what happened is the Israelis got intelligence that these characters were there in Gaza, and they went after them. And in going after them, they went after them not in a very precise strike, but in a strike that's killed a lot of people. And they say it started a fire. Well, I can tell you one precise
more than
weapon
a fire,
doesn't start a fire. I mean, the weapons that can be used, precise weapons, I know for a fact, you can choose whether you want them to go into the driver's side of the car or the passenger side of the car.
Also, the injuries reveal it's more than a fire, isn't it? Don't they?
These were big bombs, not precise missiles like the brimstone missiles that can be used. And so I think that the Israelis, again, are going after people with big bombs to make sure they get them. So they wanted these two particular people. That can be legal because they're at war with Hamas. But what is not very legal, or what is very questionable, is whether there is any other way of getting hold of these people and bombing, and whether due regard is taken of civilian casualties if you do go after them.
Israel, on
that basis, they've not got very much. They haven't got really a leg to stand on, and they never produce evidence. They just say it's under investigation, and then it gets forgotten about 2 weeks later.
But on that, Israel, two things Israel would say to what you've just said, or typically do say to those kinds of statements, is that they are doing nothing different to what, say, Western forces did in Raqqa to beat Islamic State. When Islamic State were routed in places like Raqqa, in Syria and Iraq, was it comparable to what we're seeing here? We didn't have quite as much social media imagery from those situations, did we, as we're seeing in Palestine?
No.
And I guess there wasn't as much. It seems to me, you know better, being a closer watcher of these things. It didn't seem to me there was as much scrutiny of these events as there is in Israel. And one of the complaints Israel makes, and its supporters make, is that it is held to a different standard when it is defending itself, when it is at war.
Yeah, and you're right. There isn't as much coverage in the popular media as there was in the battle against Islamic State. That's certainly true. And it is also true that Israel is defending its own homeland against a vicious attack by Hamas. And Israel does have a legal right to say we have to destroy Hamas. I think most of the Western world certainly agrees with that. But I don't think it's true to say that they're being held to a higher standard than the Allies conducted again in the fight against Islamic State. Again, I know for a fact that a lot of Allied aircraft came back with their bombs and their missiles because they couldn't identify the targets securely enough, or there were too many civilians around there. It happened all the time. In fact, the operation against Islamic State took quite a lot longer than it might have taken, simply because the targeting policy was much tighter and had greater integrity. That doesn't stop mistakes being made, but I think there's a difference in a targeting policy that tries genuinely to avoid civilian casualties, and one that is quite honestly quite cavalier about civilian casualties. When the Israelis have a target to go after, they go after it almost regardless of the civilian casualties. They claim that isn't the case, but if you look at the numbers, it's very hard to sustain their argument. And as I say, when they say we're investigating, they say this every time, and nothing happens.
It's the whole scenario is becoming more and more entrenched, isn't it? On from October the 7th, it's becoming more and more entrenched. Talks are due to start again this week, I hear. I mean, who knows whether they'll come about after this. But you said something interesting in your opening comments, that the Palestinians are the only people who suffer. And I know what you mean when you say that, because clearly in terms of physical injury and harm and death, in terms of displacement, of course, that is true. There is displacement within Israel as well, but not in the conditions that there's displacement in Gaza.
Correct.
But the hostages and their families, body after body after body is being brought out here of Israeli hostages. There was the video last week of the young women who are still being held, and the image of them being taken and being abused, and seeing their own friends shot dead in front of them and all the rest of it. There's a great deal of suffering in Israel still, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. And again, we go back to the fact that this began on October the 7th with an absolutely wicked atrocity, which was played down across Arab media, across the Arab world. I mean, in the Western sources, we got a fairly good idea of it within 3 or 4 days. And it was absolutely outrageous. And one of the things that is, in a sense, is most depressing to somebody like me, and who analyzes these things and follows them, is how indirectly dishonest a lot of Arab media was, because they sort of pretended that attack was somehow just a military to military attack across the border in response to Israeli provocations. And of course, it wasn't that at all. It was the most wicked sort of terrorist atrocity conducted as widely as possible against as many people as possible. And yes, of course, it's left an awful lot of grieving people in Israel. It's left Israel shocked, because one of the features of Israeli policy over the last 30 or 40 years is to say to people around the world, look, if you're a persecuted Jew, come to Israel and you'll be safe. This is your homeland. You will be safe here. And the 7th of October attacks have actually diminished that sense of safety in a very unpleasant way. And
on the hopes for better for both sets of people, these talks, I mean, can you imagine that they'll take place? I mean, sometimes, the worst things do happen and talks still continue extraordinarily. Yeah. But what's your sense of that? Or is it difficult to tell from our position?
Well, I think the best we can hope for is a temporary ceasefire. And the Israelis, again, will delay that until they've taken more of Rafah itself, and the release of some hostages. And Hamas will delay that and maybe release a few of the remaining, those hostages who remain alive, and the number might be relatively small of the hostages who remain alive. So both sides will delay, because both sides are still playing politics with the whole thing. In the broader sense, we can't even get to square one yet. I mean, square one is where we say there has to be an all-Palestine solution, not just a Gaza solution, but a solution for the West Bank and Gaza. It has to be something around the two-state solution, even though the two-state solution has been dead for some time now politically, but it has to be something derived from that. And it's got to involve reconstruction and a new deal, both for Israel and for the Palestinians. Now, that's square one, and we can't even get to square one yet, because the war just keeps going round in circles. The Israeli military response is frankly incoherent. I cannot give you a sensible strategy that the IDF are now following, and I don't think they can either.
No. I mean, members of the war cabinet itself have given
That's right.
People like Benny Gantz have given Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it was a June the 8th deadline
That's
for
right.
some kind
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
some
And
kind of
Yoav Gallant has
cohesion.
said the same. He said he said we cannot carry on asking the IDF to keep on operating like this because they're doing no good. It's what's known as a whack-a-mole strategy. Every time they see a terrorist pop up, they whack it. But the Hamas people are moving back into the areas that the Israelis have already cleared once,
In
in
the
some
north.
cases twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole thing is militarily going nowhere. And politically, Netanyahu will not move forward politically because he's caught by his ultra right-wing Zionist minority that he depends on to keep the government alive, and the sort of pragmatists like Benny Gantz and even Yoav Gallant, who I wouldn't have said he was a pragmatist before this crisis, but he is these days, who are demanding something else. And so he's caught absolutely in the middle, desperately trying to cling on to power. And until that changes, nothing changes politically, and the killing goes on, the military operation goes on, and it's leading us not even to square one to begin to get ourselves out of this, or for the world to begin to get out of this situation.
And I've been talking this hour to my callers about the general election, about the party leaders, and Keir Starmer was asked about his position on this morning. You get the feeling it is going to, or certainly has the capacity to, become a very central theme in this general election, depending on what happens.
It might well, yeah. It's already derailing the American election, which hasn't officially begun yet, in a way. But we all know that the Americans are in election year, and it's already a major factor in that, both for and against Democrats and Republicans, because it cuts across the parties, and I think it will do here. It creates intercommunal tension. It leads people into very entrenched positions. It's very hard to get an objective truth out of this because it's an ongoing war. And again, I mean, journalists are not allowed into Gaza. So what we know that's coming out of Gaza is coming out from either Palestinian sources or some of the medics who are there, but no journalists
just citizens
are allowed into Gaza.
Yeah, just citizens taking footage as well. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Michael Clarke.